I am Brian Champion, the Political Science and World Politics Librarian and coordinator of the House of Learning Lecture Series. We welcome students, colleagues, faculty, and invited guests here today to hear Ms. Jessie Embry deliver today's House of Learning lecture entitled Spiritualized Recreation, Church Ball and Dance Festivals, 1908 to 1971. The library sponsors two main lectures and lecture series, the House of Learning Lectures and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship Lecture. Through these lectures, the library brings together scholars and students to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning Lectures series title is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge, and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. Now, about today's lecturer. Jessie Embry received her bachelor's and master's degrees in history from BYU, and is currently the Associate Director of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies. She has worked at the center for 30 years and has directed many oral history projects that are housed in the L. Tom Perry Special Collections. She is the author of 9 books and over 100 articles on Mormons, women, the American West, and Utah. Most of her writings are based on oral history interviews. Her latest book is Spiritualized Recreation, All Church Athletic Tournaments and Dance Festivals, which is an ebook and available without cost on the Charles Redd Center webpage. A gifted scholar, teacher, and researcher, it gives great pleasure to welcome today's House of Learning lecturer, Ms. Jessie Embry.
About 5 years ago, I had been researching baseball, and I was looking for a new topic to research. And I thought I was going to just do Utah basketball. And I started reading old newspapers, and as I read the old newspapers, I noticed that the all church tournaments were covered almost as much as any other basketball that took place in the state of Utah. And so after looking over a number of things, I decided to create an oral history project to interview people who remember the experiences. I started out actually doing just basketball. And I sent out a press release, and a Desert News reporter came down, took a picture of me as he stood on a ladder and looked down through a basketball hoop, and I was wearing that famous t-shirt, Church Ball, the brawl that begins with a prayer. And then I got tons of emails and tons of letters, and we went out and interviewed a number of people, and now after we also got people who had played softball and who played volleyball. And then we even expanded it to include the dance festival and some other activities. And so this is the result of that particular research. The term spiritualized recreation was one that was used by the church. Recently I was in a primary opening exercises, and they were reading the declaration to the world about the family, and it said that we believe in wholesome recreation. And I thought, some of these little kids probably don't know what they mean by wholesome recreation. Some people might wonder what spiritualized recreation was, but that is something that was a term that was used, and recreation at that time was seen as a way to promote spiritual activities. Today I have centered my comments around some comments that were made by Thomas O'Day, who wrote a book called The Mormons in 1957. O'Day was a Catholic who went to the American Southwest with a Harvard group to study a variety of different groups, including the Mormons. He later left that project, but he wrote this study, The Mormons, which became a classic for particularly sociologists to use. And what he did in this book was to try to see where the church was at that particular time, and then to predict what might happen in the future. For the 50th anniversary of this book, some sociologists here on campus have published a book of essays in which they look at O'Day's study and see where he got things right and where he got things wrong. O'Day actually says very, very little about recreation, but what he says provides a nice framework for what I want to talk about today. So he said, as the screen said, and I'm not always going to read all the words on the screen because you can read, and that's why I put them up there so I don't have to read them to you, that recreation is related to work and health, and that it serves to refresh man, and that has his own purpose. He also said that only in the field of recreation has Mormons been able to meet the challenge of a secular world. So what was church recreation in 1957 and before? Brigham Young started the Young Ladies, later the Young Women's Mutual Improvement Association, and then later started the Young Men's Mutual Improvement Association. When these auxiliaries were first started, they actually were involved in both theology and in recreation. In 1905, Joseph S. Smith did a correlation in which he tried to look at where the priesthood was, and the priesthood became the responsibility for teaching theology, and the YMIA and the YWMIA became responsible for recreation. And they were involved in a variety of programs. Some of them I've listed here: a basketball tournament, later a softball and volleyball, tennis and golf, and even a horseshoe tournament. And recreation that included dance, speech, and music and drama. For the purpose of this presentation, which can't go on forever, we'll actually focus on basketball and dance, with a little bit more on basketball because I have a little bit more on basketball. So I'm going to take O'Day's comments about how the all-church tournaments developed and show you how the basketball tournament fit into those. So O'Day wrote that basketball began as unplanned but approved. It became more and more part of the church context. As you probably all know, basketball was invented in around the 1890s as an indoor sport, and the Mormons caught on to it quickly. In 1906, members of the Ensign Ward in Salt Lake were playing basketball. And the ward thought, well, we shouldn't just have these kids playing basketball. We should get them involved somehow and get it into somehow a ward activity. So the ward leaders created 2 teams. And not only did they get judged on when they played against each other for the score of the game, but they were judged, they won if they had high attendance of other people coming in, and if they went to their church meetings as well. So it wasn't just going to basketball games, it was going to church meetings. That was in 1906, and it was so successful that 2 years later, the Ensign Stake started having all the wards form teams and started a tournament. And in that year, the Improvement Era published an article, which you can see on display in my little exhibit, called Wards and Gymnastic Halls in the Improvement, that talked about how you could use cultural halls, which sometimes had very low roofs or were not quite big enough to play basketball, could also be used to play basketball. The reason why this physical education professor at the University of Utah, who was also involved with the Ensign Stake, wrote the article was he said that he got numerous inquiries about having a physical education program in the cultural halls, and that people wanted to make attractive rooms for basketball, handball, and gymnastics without little expense. But the author said that he was focused on basketball because it was the greatest of all indoor games in the country, and especially here in the state of Utah. And because this article was published in 1908, you could say that this is the centennial of church ball. So we're celebrating one of those round numbers that we all like to look to. After after the Ensign Stake had been playing basketball for a while, they got sort of tired of playing each other, and so all the stakes in the Salt Lake Valley got together and formed a tournament in the 1920s. In 1929, that tournament became an all-church YMMIA tournament, and then continued to expand until 1971, when it was done away with. The common phrase used about the basketball tournament was that it was the largest basketball tournament in the world. Interestingly enough, a group of Catholics in Chicago advertised that they were the largest basketball tournament. Then calling it the largest was probably based on the number of people that participated. In the late 1920s, they said that 8,000 young men were participating. In the early 1930s, they said 10,000 young men were participating. And by the time that the all-church tournament ended in 1971, there were 3 divisions of junior, senior, and college. So, and all of them were set up almost exactly like, well, what we think of as the NCAA and as the even pro. I mean, it was as exciting as those kinds of basketball tournaments. So once the church took it over, as many things that the church takes over, the church program was characterized by a large degree of central planning and direction, according to O'Day, and that was definitely true. There was an athletic committee that was appointed, and that's all they did was plan all church tournaments. We've interviewed some of the people that were the secretaries for that, and they said they attended meetings and took minutes all year long to be able to plan the tournament. And then they had to do all the activities that involved in putting together the tournament. If you look closely at this photograph, you'll see that they have a program that is opened with basketball. And there were programs for all of the tournaments. So here is a junior basketball program for one that took place at the Old Deseret Gym in Salt Lake City. And those basketball programs included pictures of various teams and where they were from, and advertisements. In addition to putting out the programs, they also provided housing for those who came from out of town. Some of you probably remember. And one team particularly remembered they stayed in the Hotel Utah, and the whole team got put in exactly one room. The church also provided meals for the people, and in 1952, what we know as KFC opened its first franchise in Salt Lake City called Harmon's, and people remember going to Harmon's for their food while they were there. But there was even more that was involved. First of all, they had to have gyms. This was a big tournament that had a lot of different games going on at the same time, so they had to use like the Edge Hill Ward teams and other gyms, and they had to use the Deseret Gym. And by the time that the program ended, it had grown so large that there were so many people that wanted to come that the final game was played at the University of Utah gymnasium. And then they always had an opening devotional where a general authority or a member of the YMIA athletics committee would talk about how we're going to be playing basketball, but this is also a part of life. They had opening ceremonies, maybe not to rival what happened at the Olympics just a little while ago, but all the teams marched in, and they had the Star Spangled Banner was sung. They sang God Bless America. It was a big opening ceremony that people were proud of. And then they would have a banquet that the general authorities were especially encouraged to attend so that they could meet the players. Now, women did not participate in the all-church tournaments in terms of playing, but they were sponsors, cheerleaders, tour guides for the different teams that were coming in. And there were usually 2 young women, laurels or gleaners, depending on the age of the team, assigned to work with the teams and to show them around Salt Lake, to be in front of them when they paraded in, have fires, have socials for them. They were encouraged not to date, though we do have some examples of people that ended up marrying one of the sponsors. And I particularly love these pictures because they say so much about the styles of the 1940s and the 1950s. And of course there were trophies. These are just little trophies, but the first place trophy for winning the tournament was large, and then the sportsmanship trophy for having the best sportsmanlike team was even larger. And whatever size trophy you got, the team was excited to get it and proud of it. What's really remarkable for me is not just these general facts, though, but the stories that people tell about their teams. So I'm going to tell you just 3 short stories about teams and how they developed. This is the Grantsville 2nd Ward that were the champions of the basketball in 1944. They posed for a picture, as you see, and then they had a reunion 50 years later where they posed again. It's fun for me to notice who they are. I've sort of cropped the championship team so you can't see everybody in it, but if you look at how people have their arms draped around each other, that sort of explains who's who. And on the back row, there is one person missing because he had passed away. Playing basketball together created not only a community for these young men as they were playing basketball, but it created a community for them as 50 years later they still felt a closeness because they had participated. It was really hard for that Grantsville 2nd Ward to get to the all-church tournament. They had one team that always beat them out in regional. They could never get past that team in regional. And so one year they finally won. And they were so excited, and they finally got to go to all-church. They were the ones that everybody stayed in one room in the Hotel Utah. I'm surprised they didn't make them go home because they weren't that far away. And they remembered, it's remarkable to have these people listen, and they talk about the games that they played as if they happened yesterday. They could remember they beat a team from Oregon, Idaho, and Wyoming, and then they played their championship game against Plain City, Utah. And they were a good team. They impressed the press. So the Deseret News called them players, a great squad of sharpshooters and nifty ball handlers. But interestingly enough, they were good sports, and they also impressed the team that they beat for the championship. So Plain City had a banquet after the tournament to congratulate themselves on being 2nd place, and they wrote at the end of their poem, they wrote about each one of the players, and then at the very end they wrote, the rub game came on Saturday night, Grantsville a team real sharp, strong. It was no disgrace to lose to them. Feeling bad would be dead wrong. So here we are, church runner-up. So they were enough impressed with the Grantsville team to even say it was not bad to lose to them. They were a class team. Now the Grantsville team won the all-church tournament. And you would think, well, of course, if you won, then you remember it. And lots of the people that called up and volunteered to be interviewed were people that had won the tournament. But you could create a sense of community even if you didn't win the tournament. So this is a team from Glenwood, Alberta, who came just after World War II. They came down. They loved teasing their sponsor. Their sponsor said, "What's it like in Canada? Is it a little strange up there? Is it always snow?" And the team just played right along and said, we had to come from by dog sled to the U.S. border, and then we could finally get in a car. They thought so much, though, even they came and they played their first game, and they lost to Grantsville's second, and then they came, and then it was a elimination bracket, so they could go into the consolation bracket, and they lost their second game, and they were finished. They'd only played 2 games, but it had such a lasting impact. Then in the 1990s, the whole team got together again and recreated their picture, just like the Grantsville 2nd Ward had, standing in exactly the same places that they had before. And they put together an entire book where they explained what they had done since the tournament and what the tournament meant to them. A copy of the book, although it's closed, is on display along with a medal that they had created because they were their state championship. When I asked for people to respond to the article to see if they would be interviewed, Richard Perkins from Blanding sent me a message and said, "You need to come to Blanding because Larry Alexander, who was our coach, who is in his 90s, is still alive." So fortunately, one of my interviewers' husband was from Blanding, so she had the right Harris name, so people knew who she was when she went down there. And she went down and she interviewed a number of people, including Brother Alexander. I just had some students in a History 200 class read Alexander's interview, and they were just amazed that a man in his 90s could remember the scores of the games and who they played and even the plays. He taught and then we interviewed Richard Perkins, which was a little bit too modest to tell us in the interview that he was the most valuable player in the tournament that they won in '54. It just makes me laugh when we look at those length of those shorts that basketball uniforms used to be instead of the baggy ones that they wear now. Just a little bit about that team. The Grayson Ward was one of the wards in Blanding, and they started out playing just community ball, and then they started playing MM ball. Richard Perkins remembered that some of the young men weren't necessarily going to church at all times, and so they started going to church so they could play MM ball. And they didn't have much competition in their stakes, so they drove around great distances to play junior colleges. One of my favorite stories is that, this really is probably not true, but they were speeding as they were coming back from Durango, and a highway patrolman turned on his lights on them. But instead of pulling over, the guy driving just kept going. And when he crossed the state line, the state trooper stopped following him. I hear that's wrong, that the state trooper can cross the state line. They were assigned to a region where they always won. And Brother Alexander said, well, we were so good, we always went up in price, that they assigned us to Colorado. They were just trying to eliminate us. But they went frequently, and every year that they went, they got in the top 8 teams. So he said, though we didn't always win, we were never eliminated. There were so few things to do in Blanding. That's what the interviewees said, not me, that everybody came to the game. So the whole ward would show up for the game, and they'd have a great time watching and cheering on their team. And when the team went to the all-church tournament, the year they won, it was actually held here in Provo. To avoid making a long-distance charge, Brother Alexander would call the operator in Blanding. They just had one operator, and he would just say 2 numbers. First was the score that the Blanding team had, and the next number was the score that the other team had. But there were so many people that wanted to come to the game that when they came to the championship game, they all came up from Blanding. I remember reading like 700 people came, so it was almost the whole town of Blanding. So basketball was a big activity and an all-church tournament. But so that we can include some women, we're going to talk some about dance too. The church sponsored all kinds of different types of dances, gold and green balls that were held once a year, and summer dances and sort of like stake dances that they have now for the young people. But they also had an all-church dance festival, which in 1928 started as a contest, was held at the old resort out on Great Salt Lake called Saldair. It moved from being a contest to just being local and state dances, had tournaments, and then those who participated could come and take part in the dance. And it grew so big that by 1947 they had moved to the University of Utah football stadium. Well, it's obviously they're playing football there, as they will be tonight. But it was a little smaller in those days. I wanted to tell you a story about one person who participated in that dance festival, and that was Clayton Pratt Bishop, who he and his wife were the dance instructors here in Wayne County, Utah. They went to Gunnison to learn the dances because everyone had to learn exactly the same dances. They learned them from the MIA field secretary, and then he went back to Wayne County and he taught one couple from the 4 towns in Wayne County the dance, and then they came up to Salt Lake to participate. And he remembered that it was just exciting because there were 10,000 people that had learned the same dance, and there were dancers from even Alberta, Canada. And it was so nice because they had such big costumes, and they marched in where they were playing the MIA song, Carry On, and we looked at the old flag and saw it waving. It was a thrill to watch everybody doing the same steps at the same time. And it was amazing that they would just call the dance, and everyone would step off in tune, and everyone was going there. And they got so excited in 1947 about dancing that even when the dance festival was finished, they just wanted to keep dancing. So probably that stadium that was completely filled, the people left, but everyone else just on the dance kept dancing until, quote, the orchestra quit first and got tired. but we still wanted to dance. In 1952, 15,000 people were turned away from the performance because there was only one performance, and there was a 2-hour program that included all types of different dances, and it gave the dancers fun, and it was enjoyable for the audience. And the church news wrote that they would turn off all the lights while the other people got into their place, and then there would just be these dancers with all the color and all the great dancing skills. They started with a flag ceremony and an opening prayer, and then some junior gleaners and gleaners all dressed in white formals came out to the tabernacle choir singing "Carry On." And the article concluded, to a man, everyone, of course, thoroughly enjoyed the great show. It was so successful that in 1953 there were 50,000 spectators, and they had it over 2 nights, 9,000 dancers, and 3,000 who participated in an all-girls dance. In 1963, there were 7,000 dancers, and they had the theme Behind the Blue Horizon, and they charged a small admission fee. In 1971, it cost 50 cents for a stadium seat and $1 for a chair seat. A little less than what football tickets cost, right? So just why was there church recreation? O'Day said that recreation had become an important expression of Mormon group solidarity, and it provided a way to have attitudes towards the church and the world, and it also led to eternal progression, met the mission of the church. So how did it do that? Well, some of the goals were spiritual. One was to build testimonies. If you get young men to play basketball and then they were required to attend church, then they could feel the Spirit and build their testimony. It could reactivate inactive members, like those people in Blanding, and it could also be missionary work. You could not have, all your team could not be non-members, and they all had to participate in going to church and live in the word of wisdom. But there were young men that wanted to play church ball and chose to do that instead of playing their high school ball. There are also some social reasons. One was that it was good sportsmen. They had to portray good sportsmanship in playing the game. In the Edgehill ward, there was a man that in charge that said, there's the chapel where you learn about the gospel, but here on the basketball floor is where you practice what you learn in the chapel. And they also wanted to encourage participation. So people that played high school ball did not play church ball, as is now the case, but they also gave people who never had a chance to play a chance to participate. And there are some people I know that grew up during this time of church sports, and they chose to play church sport instead of playing high school ball because it was more exciting to go to the all-church tournament than it was to go to their high school tournament. But in 1971, there was an announcement in June Conference, which was the conference that was for the training the leaders for the Young Men Mutual Improvement Association and the Young Women's Mutual Improvement Association, and where actually the dance festival took place, that said that would be the end. And there was a New Era article that appeared that said there would be no more all-church tournaments, and there would no more all-church dance festivals. Instead, they would focus on regional activities. Now, there's several reasons why these changes took place. One was a change in the kinds of officials they were using. They stopped playing officials. One was that there were some abuses of the system. Some teams actually recruited players and said, you know, if you come to California and live in our ward boundaries, we'll give you a job. I even heard just recently that there was a threatened lawsuit because of injuries that took place during games. But I think that the major reasons are what I have listed here. The church had grown. It was a worldwide church, and there was a shift to a spiritual focus. Let's talk first about growth. If you look at this list of how many stakes and wards were organized in the church during the 1960s, you can see how much bigger the church was. Only 20% of those new stakes and wards were in Utah, and a fourth of those were actually here at BYU when they started creating the student wards and calling them wards. 60% were out of the United States. Let's look at it from a church angle then. In the 1950s, there were 17 divisions. So stakes would play their tournaments, and the winners would go to a division tournament, and then the winners would come to Salt Lake. And 8 of those divisions were in Utah, and only 3 were outside of the West. By the 1971, there were 39 zones, which then were broken down into divisions and regions. So it was a lot of people to try to bring everyone in for a tournament. And by having the church so large, James B. Allen and Glenn Leonard wrote in their book, The Story of the Latter-day Saints, that the elimination of all church was to stimulate greater local participation and to cut down on the expenses and problems involved in those annual treks to Salt Lake City. But the church has also grown worldwide, and what O'Day said was that there would come a time where Salt Lake would no longer be the major focus point. Armin Moss, a sociologist who's written a book called The Angel and the Beehive, agreed that the church was no longer so focused on Utah, that people looked to their own temple and looked to their own cultural community and tried to create that. Also, by having a worldwide church, not everybody in the world plays basketball, volleyball, and softball. Yeah, softball's even being eliminated from the Olympics now. So, and the entire recreational purpose was to build Latter-day Saints, so you needed to build Latter-day Saints throughout the world and not with just those American sports. And the new program would allow local priesthood leaders to select sports like soccer or lacrosse that are played in other places and not just those used in U.S. and Canada. But another important reason was also there was a new focus on spiritual activities. O'Day said that, he actually said it in a very long, complicated way, the summary of what he was trying to say is that churches should stick to spiritual things because that they do very well. And community and government can do sports and they can do it better. Not everyone would agree with that, but it definitely was something that he saw was coming, and Armin Moss agreed that gone are the competitions provided by the old MIA. Instead of having those competitions, they had priesthood correlation and youth temple trips, and that this spiritual core would link the whole universal religion. So we had all these church tournaments, and then they went to regional play, and some regional plays went away. In some places it continued. In my particular state, because of some problems with bad sportsmanship in regional play, my state stopped participating, but now it's come back again. And part of it might be due to this statement that would appeared in the Ensign in 2004, that local leaders should hold stake and multi-state events to provide an opportunity for unity and to develop friendships. And you can probably think of a variety of different examples, not only in terms of sports, but in some cultural activities. So for this bicentennial of Joseph Smith's birthday, there were a lot of celebrations. This one's at the University of Utah Stadium, where many people spelled out Joseph even out there in the stands, and temple dedications where the youth put on a program. And the church still has and never completely did away with athletic, with church ball and with dance festivals, but it had a heyday in the 1950s and 1960s. So I have written a book called Spiritualized Recreation that is on the Charles Red Center webpage. And you can download it with no charge, as was mentioned. And we have a few images. This one is what I have with my exhibit of President Benson throwing out a softball. And in addition to the book being there, that you can also purchase a copy today if you would like of the book for $15, a hard copy, rather if you don't want. I don't read things on the screen, I read things in paper. But if you have more additional stories that you would like to add, we've created a blog. You have to apply for membership because we did an open blog and we're getting some weird things on it. So if you apply for membership, it sends me an email, and then you can type any stories that you have that you could tell about the All-Church Tournament, and we'll archive them along with the interviews here in Special Collections. It's a fun time of church activity that's at a different level now. It's not all church. We probably can't do all church, but there definitely are programs still going on in the church that help us to be able to combine activity and to have spiritualized recreation. Thank you.